Without Judge Whitfield's scholarship, Maria said, I never could have taken the advanced classes that prepared me for college. She made mistakes, but she's working to fix them by helping other kids like me. Meanwhile, Keisha Williams was flourishing beyond anyone's expectations. At age 13, she was already taking graduate-level mathematics courses. Universities were competing to recruit her for their programs. Keisha had also become an advocate for educational equity. She spoke at schools and conferences about the importance of recognizing gifted students from all backgrounds. What happened to me in Judge Whitfield's courtroom was painful, Keisha said at one event, but it also showed me how many kids are probably being overlooked or discouraged by adults who don't believe in them. I want to make sure other children get the chances they deserve. Rosa Williams was proud of how her granddaughter had turned a negative experience into motivation to help others. Rosa had also forgiven Margaret, though the relationship between the families remained formal and respectful rather than warm. I can see that Judge Whitfield is really trying to change, Rosa said. She's doing good work with the scholarship and the training, but the most important thing is that she treats the children who come before her with respect and fairness. Margaret's personal life had also changed significantly. Her relationship with her daughter Lisa had improved as Margaret became more aware of her own biases and assumptions. I'm proud of the work you're doing, Mom, Lisa told her during a visit. You made a terrible mistake, but you're taking responsibility and trying to make it right. That takes courage. Margaret had also developed meaningful relationships with some of the families she was now helping through her volunteer work. She had learned about their struggles and dreams in ways that made her a better judge and a better person. 2 years after the incident, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from Keisha Williams. The letter read, Dear Judge Whitfield, I wanted to let you know that I will be starting college next year at age 14. I'm going to study mathematics and education because I want to teach other young people to love learning the way I do. I know that what happened between us was hard for both of us. I hope you know that I don't hold anger toward you anymore. I can see that you're working to help other children, and that means a lot to me. I hope you'll continue to remember that every child who comes into your courtroom has potential that might not be obvious at first glance. Thank you for learning from our experience and using it to help others. Sincerely, Keisha Williams. Margaret cried when she read the letter. Keisha's forgiveness meant more to her than any award or recognition she had ever received. Margaret wrote back, Dear Keisha, your letter means everything to me. I am so proud of your achievements and your generous spirit. You have taught me more about justice and fairness than 30 years of legal training ever did. I promise to carry the lessons you taught me into every day of my remaining career. I will never forget that behind every case is a real person with hopes and dreams that deserve to be respected. Thank you for your forgiveness and for inspiring me to become a better judge and a better person. The story of Judge Whitfield and Keisha Williams became a case study in law schools across the country. It was used to teach future lawyers and judges about the importance of examining their own biases and treating all people with dignity and respect. The incident had lasting effects on the entire legal system. Courts implemented new procedures to prevent bias. Judges received better training about working with diverse populations. Children's advocates gained stronger voices in courtroom proceedings. Most importantly, the story inspired countless individuals to examine their own assumptions and biases. Teachers, social workers, police officers, and others who worked with children became more aware of how their prejudices could affect young people's lives. Margaret continued serving as a judge for 5 more years before retiring. Her later career was marked by fairness, compassion, and a deep commitment to justice for all children, regardless of their background or appearance. On the day of her retirement, Margaret received letters from dozens of young people whose lives had been positively affected by her transformation. Many were students she had helped through her scholarship fund or volunteer work. But the letter that meant the most came from Marcus Washington, the teenager she had helped instead of punished during one of her first cases after returning to the bench. Marcus had graduated from high school with honors and was now in college studying social work. He wrote, Judge Whitfield, you changed my life by seeing me as a person instead of a problem. You helped me believe in myself and my future. Thank you for becoming the kind of judge every child deserves. Margaret kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why her transformation had been so important. One moment of bias and cruelty had nearly destroyed a child's spirit, but years of conscious effort to change had helped many children reach their potential. The story proved that people can change, that mistakes can become learning opportunities, and that redemption is possible for those willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. Most importantly, it showed that every child deserves to be seen as an individual with unique gifts and unlimited potential, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Margaret's legacy became not the judge who insulted a brilliant child, but the judge who learned from her mistake and spent the rest of her career making sure it never happened again. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Margaret Whitfield walked into her courtroom with a completely different mindset. She had spent 12 months learning, growing, and working to make amends for her mistakes. The courtroom looked the same, but Margaret was not the same person who had insulted Keisha Williams. She had developed new procedures to prevent her biases from affecting her decisions. Before each case, Margaret now required herself to read the complete file. She took notes about the facts before she saw the people involved. She reminded herself to listen first and judge later. Margaret had also asked for a diverse group of advisors to help her recognize when her old patterns might be emerging. A social worker, a teacher, and a community leader attended her court sessions regularly to provide feedback. On this particular morning, a case came before Margaret that tested everything she had learned. A 15-year-old boy named Marcus Washington was charged with skipping school and staying out past curfew. When Marcus walked into the courtroom, Margaret's first instinct was familiar. He was a tall black teenager with baggy clothes and an angry expression. A year ago, Margaret would have immediately assumed he was a troublemaker headed for serious criminal behavior. But now Margaret caught herself. She took a deep breath and looked at the file she had already studied carefully. Marcus was actually an honor student who worked part-time to help support his family. He had been missing school because his mother was sick and he needed to take care of his younger siblings. The curfew violations occurred when he was walking home from his job at a grocery store. "Mr. Washington," Margaret said gently, "I see from your file that you're dealing with some difficult family circumstances. Can you tell me about what's been happening at home?" Marcus looked surprised. He had expected to be yelled at and lectured, like many of his friends who had been in court before. "My mom has diabetes," Marcus said quietly. "She's been really sick lately. I have to help take care of my little brother and sister when she can't get out of bed." Margaret nodded with understanding. "That's a big responsibility for someone your age. How are you managing with school and work on top of that?" "It's hard," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes I have to miss school when Mom gets really sick. And my job is at night because that's the only time they need help." Instead of lecturing Marcus about responsibility, Margaret worked with him and his family to find solutions. She connected them with social services to get help with his mother's medical care. She arranged for Marcus to do his community service by tutoring younger students after school, so he could earn money while helping others. "Mr. Washington," Margaret said, "you're clearly a responsible young man who cares about his family. Let's work together to make sure you can graduate and pursue your goals while still helping at home." Marcus left the courtroom feeling respected and supported instead of ashamed and angry. His mother, who had worried about how the judge would treat her son, was amazed by Margaret's understanding and helpfulness. Word spread quickly through the community about how different Judge Whitfield had become. Families who had been afraid to appear in her courtroom began to feel more hopeful about fair treatment. Margaret's transformation was noticed by other judges as well. The state judicial system asked her to lead training sessions for judges across the state about recognizing and overcoming bias. "A year ago, I was the example of what not to do," Margaret told a room full of judges. "Today, I want to share what I've learned about how our biases can blind us to the truth about the people who appear before us." Margaret's presentations were powerful because she spoke honestly about her failures. She showed the video of her treatment of Keisha and explained how each assumption she had made was wrong. "I thought I was being tough and fair," Margaret said, "but I was actually being cruel and unfair. I nearly crushed the spirit of a brilliant child because I couldn't see past my own prejudices." The training sessions led to changes in court procedures across the state. Judges were now required to complete bias training every year. New guidelines were created to ensure that all relevant information was reviewed before hearings began. Margaret's scholarship fund had grown significantly. Donations came from across the country, including contributions from other judges who had been inspired by Margaret's story of transformation. The scholarship had helped 15 gifted students from low-income families attend advanced programs. These students were excelling in mathematics, science, and other subjects. Several had already been accepted to prestigious universities. Maria Rodriguez, the first scholarship recipient, was now attending college on a full scholarship to study engineering. She often spoke about how the financial support had changed the direction of her life. After 6 weeks of bias training, Margaret knew she had to do something to try to make up for the harm she had caused. Simply learning about her mistakes was not enough. She needed to take action. Margaret's first step was to write a public apology. She spent days working on it, trying to find the right words. She wanted to be completely honest about what she had done wrong. The statement was published in the local newspaper and on the court system's website. I want to publicly apologize to Keisha Williams and her grandmother, Rosa Williams, for my unacceptable behavior in my courtroom. I made terrible assumptions about Keisha based on her appearance and background. I insulted a brilliant child who deserved praise and encouragement, not criticism and humiliation. My behavior was wrong, unprofessional, and harmful. I take full responsibility for my actions. I have been working with bias counselors to understand how my prejudices affected my judgment. I am committed to doing better in the future. To Keisha, you are an exceptional young lady with extraordinary gifts. I hope my cruel words will not discourage you from pursuing your dreams. You have the potential to accomplish amazing things. To all the children and families who have appeared in my courtroom over the years, I am sorry if I ever treated you unfairly based on assumptions rather than facts. I am working to change and to be the kind of judge you deserve. The apology was better received than Margaret's earlier attempts to excuse her behavior. Many people appreciated that she finally took full responsibility without making excuses. But some critics said the apology was too late. They pointed out that Margaret had only apologized after facing public pressure and potential job loss. Where was this understanding when she was insulting a 12-year-old girl? Wrote one commenter. She's only sorry because she got caught. Margaret knew that words alone would not be enough. She needed to show through her actions that she had truly changed. Margaret decided to start a scholarship fund for gifted students from low-income families. She used her own savings to create the fund and asked other people to contribute. Many brilliant children never get the opportunities they deserve because their families can't afford advanced programs, Margaret announced. This scholarship will help remove financial barriers for exceptional students. The first recipient of the scholarship was chosen by a committee that included Rosa Williams. Margaret had asked Rosa to help select students, hoping to show that she respected Rosa's expertise as an educator. The committee chose Maria Rodriguez, a 13-year-old who had been accepted into an advanced science program, but could not afford the fees. The scholarship paid for her classes and provided money for books and transportation. Margaret also began volunteering at a local community center that provided tutoring for low-income students. She helped with basic legal education, teaching young people about their rights in the court system. At first, the students and their families were suspicious of Margaret. They had heard about what happened with Keisha. They wondered if she really had changed or if she was just trying to improve her public image. Gradually, through consistent work and respectful behavior, Margaret began to earn some trust. She learned the names of all the students. She asked about their interests and goals. She listened to their concerns about school and their futures. One evening, a 16-year-old student named Jerome approached Margaret after a tutoring session. "Judge Whitfield," he said, "I saw the video of what you said to that girl Keisha. My mom said I shouldn't trust you because of that." Margaret felt her face get hot with shame. "Jerome," she said, "your mother is right to be cautious. I said terrible things to Keisha. I was wrong. But you're here now," Jerome said. "You're helping us learn. That means something." Margaret was touched by Jerome's words, but she also knew that earning forgiveness would take much longer than a few months of volunteer work. Margaret also began speaking at conferences for judges and lawyers about unconscious bias in the legal system. She shared her own story as an example of how bias can affect judicial decisions. "I thought I was a fair judge," Margaret told a room full of her colleagues. "I believed I treated everyone equally. But when I saw a young black girl in worn clothes, I immediately assumed she was a problem child who didn't value education. I never gave her a chance to show me who she really was." Some judges in the audience looked uncomfortable. Margaret's story forced them to examine their own biases and assumptions. "The scariest part," Margaret continued, is that I had been making similar assumptions for years without realizing it. How many children did I discourage? How many families did I treat unfairly? I'll never know the full extent of the damage I caused. Margaret's presentations were powerful because she spoke from personal experience. She was not a researcher or activist telling other people what they should do. She was a judge admitting her own failures and asking others to learn from her mistakes. The legal community was divided in their response to Margaret's efforts. Some colleagues respected her honesty and commitment to change. Others thought she was just trying to save her career. Judge Robert Chen, David Chen's father, and a respected member of the court system, attended one of Margaret's presentations. "Margaret," he said afterward, "I appreciate what you're trying to do. But the real test will be how you behave when you return to the bench. Will you actually treat people differently? Or will you fall back into old patterns when no one is watching?" Margaret knew Judge Chen was right. The ultimate measure of her change would be her future actions in the courtroom, not her apologies and volunteer work. Meanwhile, Keisha Williams was thriving despite the trauma she had experienced. The support she received after the incident had opened new doors for her. She was now taking even more advanced mathematics classes and had been invited to speak at conferences about gifted education. Rosa Williams was proud of her granddaughter's resilience, but she remained cautious about Margaret's attempts at redemption. "I'm glad she's trying to do better," Rosa told a reporter, "but Keisha is still healing from what happened. Apologies are important, but they don't erase the harm that was done." Rosa had agreed to help with the scholarship fund because she wanted to help other children, not because she had forgiven Margaret. "If Judge Whitfield really wants to make amends," Rosa said, "she needs to make sure this never happens to another child." Words are easy. Lasting change is hard. Some people criticized Rosa for not fully embracing Margaret's apology. They thought she should move on and give the judge credit for trying to improve. But Rosa understood something that many others did not. The impact of bias and discrimination on children can last for years. Keisha was strong and had good support, but other children might not recover so easily from such an experience. As Margaret continued her efforts to make amends, she realized that redemption was not something she could achieve quickly or easily. It would require years of consistent, authentic change. She also realized that some people would never forgive her, and she had to accept that. Her focus needed to be on preventing future harm, not on restoring her own reputation. 6 months after the incident, Margaret was allowed to return to limited court duties. The Judicial Review Board had determined that her bias training and community service showed genuine commitment to change, but Margaret would be closely monitored. Any sign that she was falling back into old patterns would result in immediate removal from the bench. Margaret was nervous about returning to court. She knew that every decision she made would be scrutinized. People would be watching to see if she had really changed or if her apologies had been empty words. The first test of her transformation was about to begin. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, Margaret Whitfield sat alone in her kitchen at 2 a.m. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Keisha's face with tears rolling down her cheeks. Margaret had not left her house in 5 days. Reporters still waited outside sometimes, hoping to get a statement from her. Her neighbors looked at her differently when she walked to get her mail. Some crossed the street to avoid her. The Judicial Review Board had suspended Margaret from hearing any new cases. They were conducting a full investigation into her conduct. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret was not allowed to be a judge. She picked up her laptop and read the news stories about herself again. She had read them dozens of times, but she kept going back to them. She was trying to understand how she had become the person everyone was talking about. The comments on the news articles were harsh. People called her racist, cruel, and unfit to be a judge. Many demanded that she be fired immediately. But the comments that hurt the most were the ones from other children. Young people wrote about times when adults had treated them unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. One comment from a 14-year-old girl named Ashley made Margaret cry. "When I was little, a teacher told me I would never be good at science because girls like me aren't smart enough. I believed her for years." Judge Whitfield did the same thing to Keisha, but worse. How many kids give up on their dreams because adults crush their spirits? Margaret had never thought about the long-term impact of her words before. She had always believed that being tough with children was helpful. She thought harsh criticism would motivate them to work harder. But now she was beginning to understand that her words could destroy a child's confidence forever. Margaret's daughter called her from across the country. "Mom," Lisa said, "I've been watching the news about what happened. I'm really disappointed in you." This hurt Margaret more than all the angry strangers on the internet. Her own daughter was ashamed of her. "Lisa," Margaret said, "I was just trying to teach the girl about responsibility." "Mom," Lisa replied, "I watched the video. You weren't teaching anything. You were being cruel to a 12-year-old child. You made assumptions about her based on how she looked." Margaret started to make excuses, but Lisa interrupted her. "Mom, remember when I was Keisha's age? Remember how hard it was for me when my math teacher said girls weren't good at advanced mathematics? You were so angry at that teacher. You said no adult should ever discourage a child's dreams." Margaret remembered that day clearly. She had marched into Lisa's school and demanded that the teacher apologize. She had been furious that someone would limit her daughter's potential based on gender. "But this is different," Margaret said weakly. "How is it different?" Lisa asked. "You did exactly the same thing to Keisha that my teacher did to me. You decided she wasn't smart enough based on prejudice, not facts." After the phone call ended, Margaret sat in silence for hours. She was beginning to see herself clearly for the first time in years. The next morning, Margaret received a letter from the court system. They were requiring her to attend bias training with a professional counselor. If she wanted to keep her job, she had to complete the program. Margaret's first reaction was anger. She thought the training would be a waste of time. She believed she was not a biased person, but she had no choice. If she refused the training, she would lose her job, and her pension. Dr. Sandra Johnson was the counselor assigned to work with Margaret. Dr. Johnson was a psychologist who specialized in helping people recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. Judge Whitfield, Dr. Johnson said at their first meeting, "I want you to know that I'm not here to attack you. I'm here to help you understand what happened and how to prevent it from happening again." Margaret was defensive at first. "I'm not a racist," she said. "I've been fair to all kinds of people in my courtroom." "I believe you think that's true," Dr. Johnson replied. "But let's look at what actually happened with Keisha Williams." Dr. Johnson played a recording of Margaret's speech to Keisha. Hearing her own words played back was painful for Margaret. "When you saw Keisha walk into your courtroom," Dr. Johnson asked, "what was the first thing you thought?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "I thought she looked like all the other truancy cases I'd seen." "And what do those other cases usually look like?" Dr. Johnson asked. Margaret began to understand what the counselor was getting at. "They're usually poor kids, often minorities, kids who seem like they don't care about school." "So you made assumptions about Keisha based on her appearance and background," Dr. Johnson said. "You didn't see her as an individual." Over several sessions, Dr. Johnson helped Margaret understand how her biases had affected her judgment. Margaret learned about unconscious bias, the way people's brains automatically make quick judgments based on limited information. "Everyone has unconscious biases," Dr. Johnson explained. "The problem comes when we act on those biases without questioning them." Margaret learned that she had been doing this for years without realizing it. She thought about other cases where she might have treated people unfairly based on assumptions. Dr. Johnson also had Margaret research Keisha's background. Margaret learned that Rosa Williams had been an elementary school teacher for 40 years. She had helped hundreds of children learn to read and write. She was exactly the kind of dedicated educator that Margaret claimed to respect. Margaret learned that Keisha came from a family that valued education above everything else. Rosa had worked extra jobs to pay for Keisha's university classes. She drove her granddaughter to the campus 3 times a week and waited in the car during the classes. This was not a family that didn't care about education. This was a family that cared so much about education that they were making huge sacrifices to give Keisha the best opportunities possible. Margaret also learned about the challenges that gifted minority students face. She read studies showing that brilliant children from poor backgrounds are often overlooked by the educational system. "These children face a double challenge," Dr. Johnson explained. "They need advanced academic opportunities, but they also face prejudice from adults who don't expect them to be exceptional." Margaret began to understand that her treatment of Keisha was part of a larger pattern that affected many children. She was not just one judge who made one mistake. She was part of a system that failed gifted minority children every day. The realization was overwhelming. Margaret had spent 30 years thinking she was fair and just. Now she was learning that she had been part of the problem. "What can I do to fix this?" Margaret asked Dr. Johnson. "The first step," Dr. Johnson replied, "is to truly understand the harm you caused. Then you need to commit to doing better in the future." Margaret spent hours reading about the impact of bias on children's lives. She learned about students who gave up on their dreams because adults told them they weren't smart enough. She read about talented children who dropped out of school because they felt unwelcome and unsupported. She thought about all the children who had appeared in her courtroom over the years. How many of them had she misjudged? How many had she discouraged when she should have encouraged them? The weight of these realizations was crushing. Margaret had always thought of herself as someone who helped children. Now she understood that she had probably harmed many of them. Late one night, Margaret wrote a letter to Keisha and Rosa Williams. She apologized for her behavior and asked for their forgiveness. She explained that she was learning about her biases and working to change. She wrote, "Keisha, you are an extraordinary young lady with unlimited potential. I was wrong about you in every possible way. I hope you will continue to pursue your dreams despite the terrible way I treated you." Margaret never sent the letter. She was not sure if an apology would help or hurt at this point, but writing it helped her begin to process her own guilt and shame. The training continued for weeks. Margaret learned about institutional racism, educational inequality, and the special challenges faced by gifted children from minority backgrounds. Slowly, painfully, Margaret began to change her perspective on everything she thought she knew about justice, fairness, and her role as a judge. But the hardest part was yet to come, deciding what to do with her new understanding. Maria Santos sat in the back row of the courtroom. She was a reporter for the local newspaper. She had come to court that day to write about a different case, but what she heard from Judge Whitfield made her forget about everything else. Maria had been taking notes the entire time. She wrote down every insult the judge had said to Keisha. She recorded every excuse Margaret had tried to make afterward. When the court session ended, Maria quickly walked out to her car. She pulled out her phone and started making calls to her editor. "You're not going to believe what just happened in Judge Whitfield's courtroom," Maria told her boss. "A judge just spent 30 minutes insulting a 12-year-old math genius." While Maria was calling her newspaper, other people from the courtroom were also making phone calls. Some were calling their friends, others were posting on social media. Sarah Chen was a law student who had been watching the proceedings. She was David Chen's sister, and she had come to support her brother's first big case. Sarah had recorded part of Judge Whitfield's speech on her phone. That evening, Sarah uploaded the video to social media with a simple caption: "Judge insults 12-year-old math genius in court today. This is how our system treats brilliant children." The video spread quickly. Within hours, thousands of people had watched it and shared it with their friends. By the next morning, Maria's newspaper article was the most read story on their website. The headline read, "Local Judge Calls Math Prodigy Worthless in Court Outburst." The article included quotes from Judge Whitfield's speech. It also included information about Keisha's remarkable achievements. The contrast was shocking. People began sharing the story on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Many added their own angry comments about how Judge Whitfield had treated Keisha. "This is disgusting," wrote one person. "How can a judge make such horrible assumptions about a child?" "Poor Keisha," wrote another. "She's probably smarter than the judge who insulted her." Local television news stations picked up the story. That evening, 3 different TV channels reported on what had happened in Judge Whitfield's courtroom. One news anchor said, "A local judge is facing criticism tonight after a video surfaced showing her insulting a gifted 12-year-old student." The TV stations showed Keisha's academic achievements on screen. They displayed her test scores and competition wins. Then they played audio of Judge Whitfield's insults. The contrast made Margaret look even worse. National news organizations started calling. Within 2 days, the story was being discussed on cable news shows across the country. A legal expert on one show said, "This case raises serious questions about bias in our court system. How many other children have been treated unfairly by judges who make assumptions based on appearance?" Judge Whitfield's phone started ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted comments. Advocacy groups wanted explanations. Margaret stopped answering her phone. She stayed in her office with the door locked, hoping the story would go away. But it was not going away. It was getting bigger every day. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People sent a letter to the court system. They demanded an investigation into Judge Whitfield's conduct. No child should ever be subjected to the kind of treatment Keisha Williams received, the letter stated. Judge Whitfield's comments reveal a pattern of bias that has no place in our justice system. The American Civil Liberties Union also got involved. They offered to represent Keisha's family if they wanted to file a formal complaint against the judge. Legal organizations began calling for Judge Whitfield to be removed from cases involving children. Some suggested she should be removed from the bench entirely. Margaret's colleagues at the courthouse started avoiding her. Other judges did not want to be associated with the scandal. Court clerks whispered about her when she walked by. The chief judge of the court system called Margaret into his office. "Margaret," he said, "this situation has become a serious problem. The entire court system is being questioned because of what happened in your courtroom." "It was just a misunderstanding," Margaret said weakly. "A misunderstanding?" the chief judge replied. "I've seen the video. I've read the transcripts. You spent 30 minutes attacking a gifted child based on how she looked." Margaret tried to defend herself. "I was trying to teach her about the importance of education. By calling her worthless? By saying children from her neighborhood end up in prison?" The chief judge was clearly angry. "Margaret, this is the worst judicial conduct I've seen in 20 years. Meanwhile, Keisha and her grandmother were also dealing with the media attention. Reporters were calling their house every day. Camera crews waited outside their home. Rosa Williams was torn between anger and sadness. She was glad that people were supporting Keisha, but she hated that her granddaughter had to go through this experience. "I just want Keisha to be able to focus on her studies," Rosa told one reporter. "She's a good child who loves learning. She didn't deserve to be treated that way." Keisha herself was confused by all the attention. She had gone from being an unknown student to being talked about on national television. "I just want to go back to my math classes," Keisha told her grandmother. "I don't understand why the judge was so mean to me." Universities across the country began reaching out to Keisha's family. They wanted to offer her scholarships and special programs. Mathematics professors sent letters of support. Dr. Patricia Williams, a mathematics professor at Harvard University, wrote, "Keisha Williams represents the best of what our educational system can produce. The treatment she received is a disgrace to our justice system." Online fundraising campaigns started raising money for Keisha's education. Strangers from across the country sent donations to help pay for her university classes. But the most powerful responses came from other children who had experienced similar treatment. Students wrote letters describing times when adults had made assumptions about their abilities based on their appearance. One letter came from Marcus, a 16-year-old student in California. "I saw what happened to Keisha on the news. The same thing happened to me when I was younger. Teachers assumed I was stupid because of how I looked and where I lived. But I love science and I'm good at it. Adults need to stop judging kids before they get to know us." Educational advocacy groups used Keisha's story to highlight broader problems in the system. They pointed out that many gifted children from minority backgrounds were overlooked or discouraged by adults who made unfair assumptions. "Keisha's case is not unique," said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who studies educational inequality. "There are thousands of brilliant children whose potential is being wasted because adults can't see past their own biases." As the story continued to spread, Judge Whitfield realized that her attempts to downplay the situation had failed completely. The more she tried to make excuses, the angrier people became. Margaret had never imagined that one morning in court could destroy her reputation so completely. She had been a respected judge for 30 years, but now she was known across the country as the judge who had insulted a child genius. The worst part was that Margaret was beginning to understand that the criticism was justified. Late at night, alone in her house, she would replay her words in her mind. She was starting to see how cruel and unfair she had been, but it was too late to take back what she had said. The damage was done, and it was spreading far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The story had become bigger than just one judge and one child. It had become a national conversation about bias, assumptions, and how society treats its most gifted young people, and it was only getting started. Margaret sat in her tall chair, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. The thick file lay open on her desk like evidence of her terrible mistake. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. She cleared her throat nervously. For the first time in 30 years as a judge, she did not know what to say. "Well," Margaret began, her voice shaking slightly, "I see that there has been some confusion about this case." She looked down at Keisha, who was still wiping tears from her face. The girl's eyes were red from crying, but she was watching the judge carefully. Margaret tried to smile, but it looked forced and uncomfortable. "Miss Williams, I want you to know that I always encourage academic achievement." Rosa Williams made a small angry sound. She could not believe what she was hearing. The judge was trying to act like nothing bad had happened. "In fact," Margaret continued, "I have always been a strong supporter of gifted students." Her voice sounded fake, like she was reading from a script. David Chen, the young lawyer, stood up slowly. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss the specifics of Miss Williams' situation." Margaret nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. The specifics." She picked up the file again, pretending to study it closely. "I can see here that Miss Williams has been attending additional educational opportunities." Margaret was trying to make it sound like she had known about Keisha's abilities all along, but everyone in the courtroom remembered exactly what she had said just minutes before. "Your Honor," Rosa said, standing up with dignity, "you just spent 30 minutes insulting my granddaughter. You said she was lazy and worthless. You said children like her end up in prison." Margaret's face turned red. She had hoped everyone would forget her harsh words, but Rosa Williams was not going to let her pretend it never happened. "Mrs. Williams," Margaret said, trying to sound calm, "I think there may have been some misunderstanding. When I speak to young people in my courtroom, I often use strong language to make important points about education." Several people in the courtroom looked at each other with surprised faces. They could not believe the judge was trying to excuse her behavior. "You called her worthless," Rosa said firmly. "You said she couldn't do simple math. You said children from our neighborhood don't go to universities." Margaret felt sweat forming on her forehead. She had not expected Rosa to be so direct. "Most people were too scared of judges to argue with them. I was simply trying to emphasize the importance of regular school attendance," Margaret said weakly. "By insulting a child?" Rosa asked. "By making assumptions about her intelligence based on her appearance?" Margaret looked around the courtroom for support, but everyone was watching her with uncomfortable expressions. Even the bailiff and court clerk looked embarrassed for her. She turned back to Keisha. "Miss Williams," she said in a voice that was supposed to sound kind, "I want you to know that I think your academic achievements are very impressive." Keisha looked confused. Just minutes ago, the same judge had been yelling at her and calling her a liar. Now she was trying to act friendly. "I have always believed that gifted students should be given special opportunities," Margaret continued, "and clearly, you are a very gifted student." Margaret was hoping that if she praised Keisha now, people would forget about her earlier insults. But her words sounded hollow and insincere. "Your Honor," David Chen said, "I think it's important to acknowledge that serious accusations were made against my client. Miss Williams was called lazy, irresponsible, and a waste of educational opportunities." Margaret winced. She did not want her exact words repeated in front of everyone. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I think you may be exaggerating what was said. I was simply providing guidance to a young person about the importance of education." But David Chen was not backing down. He had taken notes during Margaret's speech. "Your Honor, you asked Miss Williams if she could do simple math. You asked her what 2 + 2 equals. You suggested that children from her neighborhood don't go to universities." Margaret felt trapped. She could not deny what she had said because too many people had heard her. "I may have been a bit direct in my communication," she admitted reluctantly, "but my intentions were good. I wanted to motivate Miss Williams to take her education seriously." Rosa Williams stood up again. "Judge Whitfield," she said, "my granddaughter has been taking calculus classes at the university. She has won state mathematics competitions. She tutors college students. Exactly what about her behavior suggested that she doesn't take education seriously?" Margaret had no good answer. Every assumption she had made about Keisha had been wrong. "Mrs. Williams," Margaret said, "I can see now that Keisha is clearly a very dedicated student. I may have misunderstood the situation initially." "You didn't misunderstand," Rosa said firmly. "You made assumptions based on how we look and where we come from." You didn't bother to read her file before you started insulting her. Margaret looked down at the thick file on her desk. Rosa was right. If she had read even the first page, she would have known about Keisha's extraordinary abilities. I always review case files thoroughly, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Then why, Rosa asked. Did your clerk have to bring you the complete file in the middle of your speech? Why did you look so surprised when you read it? Margaret felt cornered. Everyone had seen her reaction when she read Keisha's records. She could not pretend she had known about them all along. Sometimes, Margaret said slowly, important information is not in the initial paperwork that reaches my desk. It was a weak excuse and everyone knew it. The file had been available the entire time. Margaret simply had not bothered to read it. David Chen stood up again. Your Honor, I think it's important for the record to reflect exactly what happened here today. A child was insulted and humiliated based on incorrect assumptions. Margaret was getting desperate. She could see that her attempts to downplay the situation were not working. Mr. Chen, she said, I think we should focus on moving forward positively. Miss Williams is clearly a remarkable young lady, and I want to make sure she has every opportunity to succeed. Margaret was hoping to change the subject away from her mistakes and toward Keisha's future. But Rosa Williams was not finished. Judge Whitfield, Rosa said, you owe my granddaughter an apology. A real apology. Not these excuses and explanations. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone was waiting to see if the powerful judge would actually apologize to a 12-year-old girl. Margaret looked down at Keisha. The girl was watching her with those intelligent eyes. Margaret could see hurt and confusion in Keisha's face. For a moment, Margaret considered giving a real apology. She knew she had been wrong. She knew she had hurt an innocent child, but her pride got in the way. She was a judge. She was used to being the most important person in the room. The idea of admitting she was completely wrong felt impossible. Miss Williams, Margaret said carefully, if anything I said today discouraged you from pursuing your education, that was not my intention. It was not really an apology. It was another excuse disguised as an apology. Rosa shook her head sadly. She could see that the judge was not going to take real responsibility for what she had done. But other people in the courtroom were taking notice. Court reporters were writing down everything that was being said. Lawyers were listening carefully. Some people in the audience were quietly taking notes. Margaret did not realize it yet, but her attempts to cover up her mistake were only making things worse. Her refusal to give a genuine apology was creating more problems than a simple admission of error would have caused. The damage was already done. And it was about to get much worse. Margaret stared at the paper in her hands. Her confident smile disappeared. Her face went from white to red. She blinked several times, thinking she was reading the wrong information. The first page showed Keisha Williams's academic records. But these were not ordinary school records. These were test scores that Margaret had never seen before in 30 years as a judge. Mathematics, 99th percentile nationwide. Reading, 98th percentile. Science, 99th percentile. Overall academic performance exceptional. Margaret's hands started to shake slightly. She turned to the next page. It showed more incredible information about the 12-year-old girl sitting in front of her. Keisha had taken the SAT test when she was only 11 years old. Her math score was 780 out of 800. Most high school students never scored that high. College students studying math would be proud of such a score. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She kept reading, hoping she would find some mistake in the paperwork. The next page showed awards and competitions. Keisha had won first place in the state mathematics competition for students under 15. She had beaten high school students who were 3 and 4 years older than her. Margaret turned another page. It showed a letter from the local university. They had invited Keisha to attend special mathematics classes for gifted students. The classes were taught by college professors. They were for students who had already learned everything their regular schools could teach them. The judge's mouth felt dry. She reached for her water glass with shaking hands. The file showed that Keisha had been attending these university classes 3 days a week for the past 6 months. On those days, she was not in her regular middle school. This was why the school had reported her as truant. Margaret read on. Keisha was studying calculus, a type of advanced math that most students don't learn until college. Her professor said she understood it better than many university students. There were more papers in the file. Letters from mathematics professors who had worked with Keisha. They all said the same thing. This girl was a mathematical genius. One professor had written, "In 40 years of teaching, I have never met a student with such natural ability in mathematics. Keisha Williams has the potential to make important discoveries in the field of mathematics." Another letter was from a famous mathematician at a university in another state. He had heard about Keisha and wanted to meet her. He wrote, "Students like Keisha come along once in a generation. She must be given every opportunity to develop her extraordinary gifts." Margaret felt like she was going to be sick. Everything she had said about Keisha was wrong. Everything she had assumed about this family was wrong. She looked up from the papers. Keisha was still crying softly. Rosa was holding her granddaughter's hand, looking angry and hurt. Margaret turned to another page. It showed that Keisha was not just good at math. She was also teaching other students. The university had asked her to help tutor college freshmen who were struggling with basic algebra. 12-year-old Keisha was teaching college students mathematics. The file also showed Keisha's plan for the future. She wanted to get her high school diploma early and start college when she was 14. Several universities had already expressed interest in giving her scholarships. Margaret's head was spinning. She had called this brilliant child lazy and worthless. She had assumed Keisha was a troublemaker who didn't care about education. The truth was exactly the opposite. Keisha cared about education so much that she was studying mathematics at a level far beyond her age. She was so advanced that her regular middle school could not challenge her. Margaret read that Keisha's grandmother had been trying to find the best educational opportunities for her granddaughter. Rosa had contacted the university program herself. She had driven Keisha to classes and waited for hours while the girl learned from college professors. Far from being a bad guardian, Rosa Williams was a devoted grandmother who was doing everything she could to help her gifted granddaughter succeed. Margaret found another letter in the file. This one was from Keisha's regular middle school principal. It explained that the school supported Keisha's university program. They knew she was learning more in those classes than she could learn in regular middle school math. The principal had written, "Keisha Williams is the most academically gifted student our school has ever had. We are proud that she has been accepted into the university program. We fully support her attendance at these advanced classes." Margaret realized that the only person who had not understood the situation was herself. Everyone else, the school, the university, the professors, her grandmother, everyone knew how special Keisha was, except for the judge who had spent 30 minutes insulting her. Margaret kept reading. She found research papers that Keisha had written about advanced mathematical concepts. The papers were at a college level. Some graduate students could not write papers this good. One paper was about number theory, a very difficult area of mathematics. Keisha had discovered a new way to solve certain types of mathematical problems. Her professors were amazed by her original thinking. Margaret felt smaller and smaller as she read each page. She had embarrassed herself in front of a full courtroom. She had attacked a child who was probably smarter than most adults. She found a newspaper article in the file. It was about young mathematics prodigies in the state. Keisha's picture was on the front page. The headline read, "Local Girl 12 Solves University-Level Math Problems." The article explained how rare Keisha's abilities were. It said that only one child in a million had this level of mathematical talent. The article called her a once-in-a-generation mathematical mind. Margaret looked up from the file. The entire courtroom was staring at her. Everyone could see that something had changed. Her confident, angry expression was gone. She looked confused and worried. Keisha was still crying, but she was also watching the judge carefully. The girl could tell that something important was happening. Margaret turned to the last page of the file. It was a letter that Keisha had written to the court herself. She had tried to explain why she had been missing school days. The letter was written in perfect English. It was polite and respectful. Keisha explained that she loved learning and that the university classes were helping her grow as a student. She promised that she would make up any work she missed at her regular school. At the end of the letter, Keisha had written, "I hope I can continue to learn and maybe someday use my education to help other people." Margaret felt tears coming to her own eyes. This beautiful, brilliant child had written such a thoughtful letter. And Margaret had responded by calling her lazy and worthless. The judge closed the file slowly. She looked around the courtroom. Everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. David Chen, the young lawyer, cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said gently, "as you can see, this is not a typical truancy case." Margaret nodded slowly. She felt like her world had been turned upside down. Rosa Williams was looking at the judge with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "my granddaughter is a good child. She has never been in trouble before. All she wants to do is learn." Margaret knew she had to say something. The whole courtroom was waiting. But what could she say? How could she apologize for 30 minutes of insults and assumptions? She looked down at Keisha. The girl was looking back at her with big, sad eyes. Those eyes were full of intelligence and curiosity, exactly the opposite of what Margaret had assumed. Margaret realized that in 30 years as a judge, she had never made a mistake this big. She had never been so completely wrong about someone. And worst of all, she had hurt a child who deserved praise, not punishment. The silence in the courtroom grew longer. Everyone was waiting to see what Judge Margaret Whitfield would do next. Margaret pushed the thick folder to the side of her desk. She did not want to read it now. She thought she already knew everything she needed to know about Keisha Williams. The judge had made up her mind the moment she saw the young girl walk into her courtroom. Margaret looked down at Keisha again. The girl was still wiping tears from her face with her old sleeve. This made Margaret feel even more sure that she was right about this case. "Stop crying," Margaret said in a cold voice. "Tears won't help you now. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to skip school." Keisha tried to stop crying, but more tears kept coming. She had never had an adult talk to her this way before. Her teachers were always kind to her. Her grandmother always told her she was smart and special. But this judge was saying terrible things about her. Margaret felt like she was doing the right thing. She thought she needed to be tough with kids like Keisha. In her mind, being kind would only make things worse. She believed that children from poor families needed strict discipline to succeed in life. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Margaret said. She pointed her finger at Keisha. "I see a child who doesn't value education. I see someone who thinks she's too good for regular school." Rosa Williams could not stay quiet anymore. She stood up slowly. "Your Honor, you don't understand. My granddaughter—" "Sit down right now," Margaret said loudly. "I am tired of hearing excuses from parents and grandparents. You people always have excuses." The words "you people" hung in the air like a dark cloud. Everyone in the courtroom felt uncomfortable. The lawyers looked at each other with worried faces. Some people in the audience shook their heads. Rosa's face turned red with anger. She had been a teacher for 40 years before she retired. She knew how smart her granddaughter was. She knew Keisha was not like other children her age. But the judge would not let her speak. Margaret continued her attack. "Children like Keisha think they can do whatever they want. They think rules don't apply to them. But let me tell you something about the real world." Keisha looked up at the judge with scared eyes. She did not understand why this woman was being so mean to her. She had always been a good kid. She had never been in trouble before. "In the real world," Margaret said, "people who don't follow rules end up in prison. People who don't go to school end up on the streets. Is that what you want for your life?" Keisha shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am," she whispered. "Then why haven't you been going to school?" Margaret demanded. "What could possibly be more important than your education?" Keisha looked at her grandmother. Rosa nodded, trying to encourage her to speak up. "I was taking classes," Keisha said in a small voice. Margaret laughed again. It was a mean laugh that made everyone in the courtroom feel uncomfortable. "Classes," Margaret said. "What kind of classes? Street classes? Classes in how to cause trouble?" "No, ma'am," Keisha said. "Math classes." "Math classes," Margaret repeated, still laughing. "Where were these supposed math classes?" "At the university," Keisha said. Margaret's face turned angry. She thought Keisha was lying to her. She thought the girl was making up stories to get out of trouble. "Young lady," Margaret said, "lying to a judge is a very serious thing. Do you know what happens to people who lie in court?" Keisha's eyes got even bigger. "I'm not lying," she said. "Of course you are," Margaret said. "Do you really expect me to believe that a 12-year-old girl from your neighborhood was taking classes at a university? Do you think I'm stupid?" The lawyer David Chen stood up again. "Your Honor, if we could just look at the records—" "I don't need to look at any records," Margaret said. "I can see what's happening here. This child thinks she can tell me any story and I'll believe it. Margaret turned back to Keisha. Her voice got even colder. Let me explain something to you about math, she said. Math requires discipline. It requires going to school every day. It requires paying attention to your teachers. Can you even multiply numbers? Keisha nodded. Yes, ma'am. What's 7 times 8? Margaret asked quickly. 56, Keisha answered right away. Margaret was not impressed. Any child can memorize simple multiplication tables. What about harder math? Do you even know what algebra is? Yes, ma'am, Keisha said. Algebra is using letters to represent unknown numbers in equations. Margaret frowned. She had not expected Keisha to know that. But she still did not believe the girl was special. Anyone can memorize a definition, Margaret said. But understanding math is different. Real math is hard. It's for serious students who go to school every day. Keisha wanted to tell the judge about the advanced calculus she had been studying. She wanted to explain about the differential equations she could solve. But she was too scared to speak up. Margaret looked at the people sitting in the courtroom. I want everyone here to understand something, she said. This is what happens when children don't have proper guidance at home. Rosa felt like someone had slapped her in the face. She had raised 5 children of her own. She had been a teacher for 40 years. She had helped hundreds of students learn to read and write. But this judge was saying she was a bad grandmother. Children need structure, Margaret continued. They need adults who will make them go to school even when they don't want to. They need rules and consequences. Margaret pointed at Keisha again. This child has clearly never learned about consequences. She thinks she can skip school and nothing bad will happen. Keisha was crying harder now. She felt ashamed even though she had done nothing wrong. The judge's words were making her feel stupid and worthless. I see cases like this every single day, Margaret said. Children who waste their opportunities. Children who could have good lives if they just followed the rules. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Do you know how many children around the world would love to have free education? Do you know how lucky you are to live in a country where you can go to school for free? Yes, ma'am, Keisha said through her tears. But you're throwing that opportunity away, Margaret said. You're being selfish and irresponsible. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Keisha crying. Everyone could feel how wrong this was, but the judge was in charge. Margaret looked at her watch again. She wanted to finish this case and move on to the next one. She had already decided what Keisha's punishment would be. I'm going to order you to attend school every single day for the rest of this year, Margaret said. You will also do community service on weekends. Maybe picking up trash in your neighborhood will teach you to respect your community. David Chen stood up one more time. Your Honor, I really think you should look at... Mr. Chen, Margaret said sharply. I have been doing this job since before you were born. I know how to handle truancy cases. Margaret turned back to Keisha. You will also write an essay about why education is important. 500 words. I want you to think about all the children who would love to have your opportunities. Keisha nodded through her tears. She did not trust her voice to speak. And if you miss even one day of school, Margaret said, you will be back in this courtroom facing more serious consequences. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am, Keisha whispered. Margaret was about to bang her gavel and end the case when she noticed the court clerk still standing next to her desk. He was pointing at the thick folder. Your Honor, the clerk said quietly, I really think you need to see this file before you make your final ruling. Margaret looked annoyed. I told you I don't need to see more paperwork. This case is straightforward, but something in the clerk's voice made her pause. He looked worried. His face was pale. Please, the clerk said. Just look at the first page. Margaret sighed loudly. She thought the clerk was wasting her time, but she picked up the folder anyway. She opened it to the first page and began to read. Her confident expression slowly changed. Her mouth fell open. Her face turned white. The paper in her hands contained information that would change everything she thought she knew about Keisha Williams. The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the courthouse. Judge Margaret Whitfield walked into her courtroom with quick steps. Her black robe moved behind her as she climbed up to her big wooden chair. She had been a judge for 30 years. Everyone in the courtroom stood up when she entered. Margaret was 58 years old. Her gray hair was pulled back tight. Her face looked serious and cold. She did not smile much. People said she was fair but tough. Some people were afraid of her. The courtroom was full that Tuesday morning. There were lawyers in dark suits. There were families sitting on wooden benches. Some children sat next to their parents. They all looked worried. Margaret sat down and looked at her papers. She had many cases to hear that day. Most of them were about young people who got in trouble. She saw cases like this every day. After 30 years, she thought she knew what to expect. The first case was about a 12-year-old girl named Keisha Williams. The papers said she had not been going to school. This was called truancy. Margaret had seen hundreds of truancy cases. She thought they were all the same. The court clerk called out loud, "Case number 2847, the state versus Keisha Williams." The big wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A young girl walked in slowly. She was small and thin. Her name was Keisha Williams. She had dark skin and wore old clothes. Her jeans had a small hole in one knee. Her sneakers were worn out. Her t-shirt was clean but faded. Behind Keisha walked an older woman. This was her grandmother, Rosa Williams. Rosa was 65 years old. She wore her best dress, but it was old too. She held Keisha's hand as they walked toward the front of the courtroom. Margaret looked up from her papers. She saw Keisha and her grandmother walking forward. Right away, Margaret made up her mind about what kind of case this would be. She had seen girls like Keisha before. At least she thought she had. Margaret looked at Keisha's clothes. She looked at the way the girl walked with her head down. She looked at the grandmother's old dress. Margaret thought she knew everything about this family already. The bailiff, a big man in uniform, pointed to a table near the front. "Please sit there," he said in a kind voice. Keisha and her grandmother sat down at the table. Keisha's feet did not touch the floor. She swung them back and forth under her chair. She looked around the big room with wide eyes. She had never been in a courtroom before. Rosa put her arm around Keisha's shoulders. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered. "We'll tell the judge what really happened." Margaret picked up a thin file from her desk. She did not open it. She thought she did not need to read it. She had seen cases like this so many times before. She thought she already knew what the file would say. A young lawyer stood up. His name was David Chen. He was new and wanted to help families in court. "Your Honor," he said, "I am here to speak for Keisha Williams." Margaret nodded. She looked down at Keisha again. The girl was looking at the numbers carved into the wooden walls. Margaret thought the girl looked bored. This made Margaret angry. "Young lady," Margaret said in a loud voice, "look at me when I am talking to you." Keisha quickly turned her head. She looked up at the judge. Her eyes were big and scared. Margaret felt powerful, sitting high above everyone else. She had seen so many kids like Keisha. Kids who did not care about school. Kids who wasted their chances. Kids who would probably drop out and get in more trouble later. "Miss Williams," Margaret said, "do you know why you are here today?" Keisha's voice was very quiet. "Yes, ma'am. Because I missed some school days." "That's right," Margaret said.
You have been skipping school.
"Do you think school is important?" "Yes, ma'am," Keisha said. "School is very important." Margaret did not believe her. She thought Keisha was just saying what adults wanted to hear. Margaret had heard the same words from hundreds of other kids. "If school is so important," Margaret said, "then why haven't you been going?" Keisha looked at her grandmother. Rosa squeezed her hand. "I was learning," Keisha said softly. Margaret frowned. "Learning? You were supposed to be learning in school, not on the streets." "No, ma'am," Keisha said. "I was learning at the university." Margaret laughed, but it was not a nice laugh. "The university? Child, do you even know what a university is?" Rosa started to stand up. "Your Honor, if I may explain—" "Sit down," Margaret said sharply. "I am talking to the child, not you." Rosa sat back down. She looked angry but stayed quiet. Margaret leaned forward in her big chair. She looked down at Keisha like she was looking at a bug. "Let me tell you something, Miss Williams," Margaret said. "I have been a judge for 30 years. I have seen hundreds of children just like you. Children who think they are too smart for school. Children who think they know better than their teachers." Keisha's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. Margaret kept talking. "Children from your neighborhood don't go to universities. They go to school every day like they are supposed to. They listen to their teachers. They do their homework." The lawyer, David Chen, stood up. "Your Honor, perhaps we should look at—" "I'm not finished," Margaret said loudly. She turned back to Keisha. "Do you know what happens to children who don't go to school?" Margaret asked. "They end up in trouble. They can't get good jobs. They become problems for society." Keisha was trying very hard not to cry. Her grandmother's face was red with anger. Margaret continued her speech. I see children like you every single day. Children who think rules don't apply to them. Children who make excuses instead of going to school. The courtroom was very quiet. Everyone was listening to the judge's harsh words. Can you even do simple math? Margaret asked. Do you know what 2 plus 2 equals? Now Keisha did start to cry. Small tears rolled down her cheeks. Margaret felt satisfied. She thought she was teaching the girl an important lesson. She thought she was being tough but fair. I want you to understand something, Margaret said. Education is a privilege. Many children around the world would love to have the chance to go to school every day, but you are wasting that chance. Rosa could not stay quiet anymore. Your Honor, please. I said be quiet, Margaret snapped. I know you probably think your granddaughter is special. All grandmothers think that. But the truth is this child needs to learn discipline. Margaret looked at her watch. She wanted to finish this case quickly. She had many more to hear that day. Miss Williams, she said to Keisha, you will return to school every single day. No more excuses. No more skipping. Do you understand me? Keisha wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Yes, ma'am, she whispered. Margaret was about to make her final ruling when the court clerk walked up to her desk. He was carrying a thick folder. Your Honor, the clerk said quietly, I think you need to see the complete file for this case. Margaret looked annoyed. I don't need to see more papers. This case is simple, but the clerk placed the thick folder on her desk anyway. He opened it to the first page. Margaret looked down at the papers. Her confident expression began to change. Her eyes grew wide as she read the first few lines. The courtroom waited in silence. Something was about to change everything.